to AT&T ThreatTraq for March 25th, 2014. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today I'm joined by Jim Clausing and Stan Nurilov. I'm Brian Rexroad, and let's go to Stan first. And Stan, you know, we do a lot of analysis. We find a lot of bad things going on. A lot of them point to domain names that are being set up, whether they're set up by machines or set up by malicious actors. You know, I think you have some good news here for us.
I do. During one of ICANN's public meetings in Singapore, several companies have backed a new initiative to support a secure domain foundation, which is going to help fight cybercrime. You know, one of the problems right now with domain names is when you register them, there is a requirement that you're supposed to provide, you know, factual information there, and the onus is on the name registrars to try to verify that as much as possible. And there's some guidelines that exist to specify, you know, approximately how much verification they need to do. But what some bad guys have done, you know, besides using Whois tools, is they've also been registering with certain type of maybe fake information or even real information. But, you know, they're known to be kind of like these shady operators, so to speak. So I think what this organization is going to try to do is they're going to provide an API, you know, to domain name registrars and others in the research community to help identify almost like a blacklist or a suspicious list of users who kind of fall into this gray area of hosting malicious content. And right now, what they have on their website, which we have a link to, is basically a call-out for people to comment on what the definition should be for, you know, malicious hosting and the evidence that should be presented to meet that criteria. So I was reviewing some of that. I see they're making progress, and I'm certainly excited for a service like this to be available. It's going to help a lot in analysis, and is going to directly benefit domain name registrars and help them to vet out, you know, people who are using fictitious information or people who are registering domains for a malicious purpose or a likely malicious purpose.
I agree, Stan. You know, and this dates back some time. I think on the order of maybe, I'm going to guess about 7 years ago. But the Government Accounting Office had done actually a study. Now, why they did that study is not clear to me, but they had done a study on domain name registries and found that on the order about 30% of the domain names that were registered had bogus information in the registry. And so that was actually an interesting finding. Now, they did not try to make a distinction between whether that bogus information was associated with malicious domain names or whether they were just, you know, outdated or something along those lines. But that number, I thought, was very telling in the sense that, particularly if you do identify malicious activity associated with a domain name, the intent of having contact information would be so that you can notify them, or if there's some kind of a problem or an error, you'd be able to notify them through that contact information. So if there's bogus information, the possibility of either not getting information to the right organization or not basically having you know, problems associated with it certainly increases. So at the very least, hopefully this will be able to help identify, I think the focus here is on malicious activity, but I suspect they're going to start stumbling across perhaps other things that are simply, you know, just to help clean up the system. And if I remember correctly, some of this concern had been approached with ICANN in the past, but they made a deliberate, you know, conveyed a deliberate message that they are not in a position or to basically police the Internet, and that's probably, you know, the correct interpretation. So it's nice to see that a group's being set up here to, I think if I understand correctly, perhaps launch through ICANN, but really sort of operating as an independent group to do this. I'll use the term policing. I don't think it's policing. It's really trying to help highlight where the problems are.
Yeah, but that's really going to be the key, is if they can exert some pressure on some of the rogue registrars who, you know, who were just in it for the money, and they would register anything for anybody as long as they got paid up front. Mm-hmm. You know, so that's been the issue. to some extent for a long time is, since nobody can touch them, really enforce much of anything, they've had no real incentive to not allow the bad guys. I mean, there are, in some of our research, pretty much any name that we see that's registered with a couple of particular registrars, we assume from the start is going to be malicious because they'll register anything. So the question is whether there will be any teeth in this and pressure those folks to change their business model a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
At the very least, I think it's going to help with building a reputation score, and perhaps that can help to have some teeth. If I know that I think maybe a few years ago, like one of the top-level domain names was completely just not even those results for those domains are not even showing up on Google anymore, just because of how much malicious hosting happened there. So even hopefully these guys can get it off the ground and make a pretty good inroads with a whitelist or a blacklist or some sort of effort, and incorporate it into the rules that right now exist for validating information. And I think it can take off from there. Just as a reputation service.
I really hope this works out, because something needs to be done to clean that up.
Yes, I think we're all sort of in the same boat here. So, nice development. Thanks for bringing that, Stan. I think it's going to be interesting to follow this, and hopefully it will be effective as we progress forward. Next topic here. I happened to stumble across an article by Forbes.com, and this one is actually from Richard Steinen. He is a contributor to Forbes on the topic of IT security. And the title of his article here is STEM Stinks for Cybersecurity. STEM obviously referring to science, technology, engineering, and math topics. And I think he has an interesting perspective here that is basically what he's making the case for, is that in particular, he focuses on short term. That is, if we want to ramp up our capability, our cybersecurity capability, his recommendation is that we should be looking more toward technical skills for specific. For example, he uses an example of specific tools, and based on some of his own experience, perhaps what he equates to somewhat vocational technology training or VOTech training, as opposed to four-year degree programs in cybersecurity or even computer science and other more general areas. And so he's making a distinction between practical skills that you can take right to the street right away and development of theoretical skills, which probably are also important, but I think what he's really talking about is somewhat of a ramping up or trying to jumpstart better skills or better capabilities in cybersecurity. I'm interested in your thoughts. Jim, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Not really sure yet. I mean, I understand the point that he's making, that you need some of the hands-on skills to be able to get in and do the work that needs to be done right now. I still, though, run into an awful lot of people that I think need a better understanding of some of the basics of computer science, how networks work and how computers work. So I don't know. I need some time to think about this one.
Stan, I don't know if do you have some thoughts on this?
I do. I think that it's important to know the practical, but the theoretical often helps to see the bigger picture, and it helps you to step back and maybe create a few tools of your own. If you're just learning about tools that exist right now, that can limit you somewhat because you're only thinking in terms of those tools and the capabilities those tools offer. If you take a step back and start thinking about more of the theoretical and the big picture, I think you can start thinking about how you can improve those tools and make them more relevant as the landscape changes. Mm-hmm. And I think that even in the last few years, the tools that we've been using have been changing. Besides the ones that we develop internally, whatever the research community has out there, it's never been the same, I think. So it's almost like you need to do that training all the time anyway, but having the theoretical knowledge of the types of issues that exist and understanding of whatever it may be, network security or computer science, it helps to guide you into at least like the realm of possible and help you pick the right tool for the job. So I think a balanced approach is always necessary. You obviously can't learn about theory without some practical hands-on experience of actually trying a tool, but you shouldn't limit yourself to the tool because then you're limiting, I think, what you can do.
Yeah, I can't count the number of times I've met somebody who's fresh out of school with, with a degree who has no idea how to do the job. The academic stuff by itself is insufficient, but I agree that I think some understanding of that helps you understand the big picture a little bit better. But I agree with Stan. I think it's a kind of a balance.
Yeah, I think you're right on track, both of you, in the sense that a balance is an important part. If you look at the medical field, it starts out very theoretical, and then they take you into more experience-based training when you get into medical school and intern programs and things like that. In fact, most four-year programs now have opportunities for getting class credit for internships, working in industry, getting some practical skills, and then bringing that back as you go to finish the degree. I think those are very important attributes of a good education program, particularly in technical skills like this. So I think one of his, sort of the slant here is he's looking at it sort of one or the other, trying to be a little provocative perhaps, and I think it's doing the right thing. It's certainly inspiring some thought on my part here, and sort of showing that there actually is some important attributes to be gained from some practical experience, and including it here. But I'll introduce one other aspect of this that personally I think is perhaps the most important, which is, one, sort of supporting the theoretical aspect. I think a big part of a lot of the theoretical training is learning how to learn and developing skills in the area of developing an appreciation for new areas of technology, for example. And from a career standpoint, I think you get a much stronger career development path if you start out with some of the theoretical base. And I think, Jim, you were kind of trying to sort of pointing that out, that you need sort of that foundation in computer science to really understand the underpinnings so that you can have longevity in your career path. So I think his focus here, Richard's focus, was really toward bumping the industry, improving our capabilities to deal with cybersecurity in the short term. But in the long term, you really, from a career standpoint, you want to have that foundation of that four-year degree or even beyond that with some practical experience to be able to develop a good career path going forward. So that's my take on it.
Yep, I agree.
All right. Well, thanks for the discussion there. I think that was very good. So let's go over to Stan here, and this one is, I think, sort of a great objective. I think it's been much more difficult than perhaps folks have anticipated, the reality aspect of this. We've been talking a lot about reflection attacks, and in each of those discussions, we point out that there are spoofed source addresses involved in this. And so the question is, how do you prevent or remove or reduce source spoofing, network spoofing, or address spoofing on the Internet? And Stan, what can you tell us?
Well, in a blog post by Comcast, their security team talks about some of the things they do to stop network spoofing, and it's actually recommendations that come from RFCs, which are requests for comments that become used by the Internet community. Obviously, some Internet protocols are defined that way. So some of the recommendations that were published were dated back to, obviously as far away as 2000 when they were officially codified. So the concepts that, that were followed are not brand new, but it is important for ISPs to try to follow those concepts. And they do talk about the specific RFC, which is basically source address, a way to filter source address spoofing. And the basic premise is, who better is going to know their network than the service provider, and who better is going to know their network and the addresses that they can send from, basically the source addresses that they can use, than the ISP that's providing the service. So one of the things that a lot of ISPs do is they block any attempt to transmit packets to the Internet that appear as if they don't come from that network, coming from that network. And that's what's covered by this RFC. But there are a couple of cases where it's actually not so clear-cut, and I think that's where some of the challenges have been for the industry. There's some large customers that don't get their IP service from just a single Internet service provider, and they might need to use that IP address actually across multiple different ISPs. And there's definitely some network services out there that use that kind of technology and let you take your IP address to multiple ISPs. So there's some technologies that exist to help you as the network ISP that help you to block any source address spoofing like that. But there are challenges that come with that, and the effectiveness is actually covered in these RFCs. It's been discussed, and the latest update was in 2004, where some of these techniques were written about and discussed, and we'll certainly have the links here for you to read that and see how it works. The other important part of this blog post is that Comcast brought to attention is that there's no benefit necessarily, any direct benefit to the users or to Comcast to implement this filtering, except as a good gesture to the Internet, meaning that by not allowing their users to abuse the service, they're being a good citizen of the Internet. And so ISPs should take it upon themselves to all be good citizens of the Internet, and where possible, implement these type of security measures, and it would certainly help the Internet be a better place. But given that, it almost seems that besides the challenges, it's up to each ISP to decide whether they're going to be a good citizen or a not so good citizen. And we certainly know that for every good citizen of the Internet, there's somebody who has an ulterior, I guess, more nefarious purpose. It kind of even ties in back to the domain name registration and providing fake information there, and some registrars looking the other way.
Yep. Yeah, there really is a sort of a need for a little bit of policing in this space, similar to what we were talking about in the domain name space. And so if I can summarize a little bit about what I think I heard you saying here is that, first of all, there's an RFC 2827, and BCP 38, BCP being referring to best common practices. First of all, to share a little bit of what sort of a philosophy I think that is a good one to consider. I oftentimes refer to as there are no rules on the Internet, there are only guidelines. And RFCs are basically a guideline for use of the Internet. Most RFCs sort of started out as a notion for interoperability so that you could have standards for communications. This RFC is basically a guideline for security. And then the BCB being best common practices is basically, if you're doing things right, that's the right thing, you should be doing it. And as you pointed out, it's based on basically being a good citizen of the Internet. I think you were getting on to the point that that's presuming that all of the participants in the Internet have a common interest and are basically good citizens. And if there is even just one provider, one ASN, autonomous system on the Internet that is not following the practices, then spoofing can occur, at least from that network service provider. So this is part of the issue that exists is when the Internet was originally defined, it was defined as a group of trusted participants, and it certainly has expanded beyond a fully trusted environment. It's a global network now. And the other aspect of it is there are even those that are perhaps technically savvy enough or not well enough funded to spend money on solving these sorts of problems. They don't see it as a problem for them. They see it as a problem for somebody else to solve. So kudos to Comcast for doing this. These are the same sorts of practices we use on our networks. Dan, I think you pointed out that sometimes there are large customers. We're talking about BGP peers in this case. Sometimes they connect to more than one network. Sometimes they connect to several networks. And so how they advertise addresses. They may be bringing their own addresses to the party. That makes it more difficult as perhaps as a transit provider to provide filtering, at least at any significant level of resolution. And I guess that's sort of a last point here is resolution is a significant part of this. That is, if you have a really huge amount of address space and you just check to see if the addresses are within that huge amount of address space, then certainly one that, you may have somebody on your right side perhaps that's spoofing an address that belongs to somebody on the left side, and that's another aspect of this. That is, resolution is an aspect of the anti-spoofing that needs to be considered. So perhaps I made a more wordy summary than you did.
Yeah, well, the filtering of this needs to take place as tightly as you can, because as it gets further away from where the address space is assigned, then you run into exactly that kind of issue. You're aggregating more and more stuff, plus then you potentially have more traffic flowing through there, at which point it becomes computationally more expensive to do the filtering there. So ideally you want to kind of push that back towards the edges as opposed to the center.
Right. One other aspect of this that's a little subtly different, we talked about the DNS and getting some policing around that. That's something that's somewhat readily visible. Now, there are some cases where the registrars are protecting the privacy of information associated with the registrants. That is, you might not be able to get HEWA's information about all domain names. So that's one little twist. But generally speaking, you can get information about who's registered domain names. Identifying where spoofed sources come from, certainly if it's transiting across other peers, is a little trickier to do. So there's a transparency issue associated with this as well. That is, it's a little more difficult to associate the presence of spoofed source addresses on the network to an organization and develop a sort of a reputation or peer pressure to correct that problem. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing today on the internet with a lot of this spoof activity is that it's clear that that's coming from places that are afar from, in fact, where we connect in many cases. All right, well, Stan, thank you for bringing that up. That's again, I think a really good topic, one that really kind of hits to the, I think, the base of opportunities to prevent some of these, obviously, spoof sources, which are facilitating reflection attacks is probably the most predominant thing, but it can also be used in other cases to actually spoof communications with systems and perhaps cause them to do things they're not supposed to. The slammer worm comes to mind as a case where you didn't necessarily have to interact with the server to infect it, and you could spoof a source address, throw the packet at a server, and infect it that way. So let's move on here. And Jim, we never have a shortage of vulnerabilities being exploited. It looks like there's yet another 0 day that has been encountered.
Yeah, this one is getting a lot of attention. Yesterday, Microsoft released a security advisory notifying folks that there was a vulnerability in Microsoft Word in the rendering of rich text format documents, RTF documents, RTF parsing, that would allow remote code execution. This is kind of a big deal because it not only is Microsoft Word, on lots and lots of Microsoft machines, but it's the rendering engine inside Microsoft Outlook. So there is fear that this could be used. Send an email, have somebody view it in the preview pane, and get exploited that way. This comes out almost dead in the middle between Patch Tuesdays. And from the looks of it, it doesn't look like there is going to be a patch for this prior to April's Patch Tuesday. There are a couple of workarounds that Microsoft is mentioning, though, and so it's worthwhile applying these. One, there's a fix-it available one particular aspect. If you have Microsoft's EMET, that's Enhanced Mitigation Experience Toolkit, that turning on the mandatory ASLR protects you against this. In Outlook, turning on just plain text rendering of emails is one way of protecting. Microsoft said they're seeing targeted attacks against Word 2010, but this vulnerability also exists in Word 2013 and I believe in Word 2007. And we had a discussion earlier today trying to figure out how widespread this is. It also appears to affect Office for Mac 2011 and also Word 2013 RT. This is the version that runs on some of the tablet devices and may even be the version that runs on Windows phones. So this could actually affect quite a few different devices. So I advise you to read the SRD blog post. Goes into a lot of detail. Security Research and Defense blog from Microsoft goes into a lot of detail on exactly what's affected and the steps that you can take to protect yourself. So I highly recommend it. They also include some IOC, some indicators of compromise, YARA rules, some IP addresses and URLs that the current attack is using. Obviously, the bad guys can always change that, but the exploit that is out there in the wild at the moment, they've got some indicators that you can use to detect that and see if you've got anybody infected in your enterprise.
That's a sobering one. It kind of makes me wish we had put it farther up in the program so we wouldn't be going into the Internet Weather Report on sort of a sour note here. But that certainly sounds like one that we need to pay attention to and to address. As you pointed out, the attackers could, they could broaden the scope and change the approach that they're using in the attack. So it's going to be important to try to get some workarounds in place and at least be cognizant of what that could look like.
Yeah, so the three big workarounds or mitigating factors are the fix-it that's available from Microsoft. If you're running EMET, you're protected there, and turning on rendering only in plain text in Outlook because Word is the rendering engine in Outlook. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a little bit reminiscent. Remember, I guess this was probably on the order of 15 years ago or so, but there seemed to be a huge rash of buffer overflow vulnerabilities associated with fonts. And I remember hearing the first sort of exploit or vulnerability associated with fonts and kind of scratching my head thinking, how can a font be a source of vulnerability? But nothing surprises me now.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's take a look at the Internet weather for the last week or so here. And first item that we have on the list, I guess hopefully this will brighten up the day just a little bit here. I mean, clearly we have an anomaly. This is on port 28017 UDP. And what we're seeing is basically scanned sources showing up on this particular port. The sources are almost exclusively U.S.-based consumers that are exhibiting this behavior. This port's not registered to anything in a formal sense, but it tends to be associated with the Mongo database, or MongoDB. But I'm pretty sure this doesn't have anything to do with that. I just included that here for completeness purposes. What it appears to be is this is associated with gaming activity. And I suspect that an organization has come out with a new game and they've introduced it. It uses this port for peer-to-peer activity, as I've mentioned a number of times before. If a port gets used for peer-to-peer activity, it can show up or appear to look like scanning activity in our analysis. So this particular one, it appears to be innocuous. In fact, for the folks that introduced this game, it looks like it's probably a good news story for them. It looks like they're getting a lot of folks that are playing that game, increasingly so. Next item here is bytes, and we also had some packet anomalies as well, but bytes on source port 161 UDP. We just got finished talking a little bit earlier about spoof controls on the network and to help prevent spoofing on the network. And the reason for that is to help protect, for one of the reasons, is to help protect against this sort of attack. We've talked a lot about NTP, Network Time Protocol reflection attacks. We've talked a lot about DNS reflection attacks. SNMP is probably ranked third, in my opinion, in terms of the frequency. Character generator also gets used from time to time. In any case, in this case, we seem to see sort of an upward trend use of SNMP in these reflection attacks. This is actually a little bit of a resurgence, in my opinion. I think what this is evidence or suggestive of the fact that so much attention has been brought to the NTP problem that a lot of activity has been underway to try to lock down or protect or fix. Actually, there's a sort of a fixed NTP as well as trying to remove unnecessary NTP servers from the Internet. And so as fewer NTP servers are available to create a good amplification, I think they're reverting or resorting to other protocols, in this case SNMP, to help facilitate those attacks. Not significant in terms of volume that we're seeing here. In this particular case, we saw one that peaked out at about 300 megabits per second, which is significantly smaller than some of the NTP attacks that were up in the order of, at least in the news, some folks are reporting attacks on the order of 300, 400 gigabits per second using NTP reflection. So in one sense, there's a little bit of a behind-the-scenes good news story here. On the bad news side, we're going to need to probably look into SNMP and make sure that as a community, as the Internet community, start to make sure that there aren't unnecessary SNMP servers on the Internet as well. Next item here is scan probes on port 22222 TCP. It's unknown what this port is used for. I wasn't able to find any references to any specific applications. Most of the probes are from a single IP address in China, and so I'm not really sure what the motivation behind this is. There's a possibility, for example, that it may be looking for a backdoor of some sort that somebody has some insight into, or it could be there was some sort of a typo that occurred. We don't know. There does seem to be a little bit of persistence around this, however. There was sort of a spat of events in early, I guess the first week of March, sort of a hiatus or a lull period, and then what we've seen is since about March 21st and continuing on through today, we've seen spiky activity scanning on this port. So it's suggestive or pretty strong indicator that there's something that they know that they're looking for, and in the end, it's a question about why or whether they're actually finding things that they're looking for. Next item here is we're looking at the top 10 most probed ports for March 24th, yesterday. What we see here at the top of the list, well, first of all, notably, we've been reporting port 5000 TCP as being one that was being targeted significantly. That has been demoted. Top of the list that we have today is port 23 TCP, Telnet. Next in line, port 22 TCP. Next, third in line, port 5000 TCP, and then followed by port 445. Port 123 UDP, this will be still some NTP reflection attack activity, perhaps probing around looking for new NTP servers or NTP servers that they hadn't identified before as well. Port 3389 TCP, that's Remote Desktop Protocol. Port 1433 being Microsoft SQL Database. And the next two here, port 80 and port 443, looking for web servers, perhaps to exploit, perhaps get to administrative ports or access those applications. Since port 23 is showing high on the list here, we've been tracking this. I'm showing the last 90 days of activity in terms of scan probes on port 23. Basically, what we're seeing here is it's still significantly elevated from what we had seen perhaps back in the beginning of the year, around the beginning of January. This graph goes back to just around to the beginning of 2014 here. Around February 1st, we saw a significant increase in the number of probes, and it's pretty much either increased or stayed that way. We're seeing a little bit of a tail off since over the last week or so here, but still significant spikes in activity as well as significant persistence in scanning on port 23. Next item here is the pie chart for most sources doing the probing. As usual, we see port 445 TCP. I'm going to have to come back with a sort of a trend graph associated with port 445 because it's been a while since we've done that. In any case, port 445 TCP at the top of the list. Next in line, port 23, with almost as many sources doing that probing, and we already looked at some of the volume associated with that. Next, in terms of actual probing activity, we see port 5000 TCP, which we've talked about in previous weeks, again, looking for a particular disk manager tool, and then port 80 TCP. And then we also have interleaved in here the latent or the continuing to diminish zero-axis P2P activity. Since the command and control for that botnet's been disabled, as time is going on, we're seeing a lot of those machines that had been infected disappearing from the network, hopefully being remediated. And last year, I thought I'd show you the trend associated with the reconnaissance index. In particular, this is the daily reconnaissance index. We're looking at the last 400 days of activity. So you can see the trend here. We're certainly still significantly higher than we had seen about a year ago. I think about 2 years ago, we were down into the 20s. We're currently up in about the high 50s here, or actually the 50s on average. But we are seeing a downward trend over the last, I would say, week or two here, which is a good sign. That's possibly a result of activity on the Internet to diminish the opportunity for doing NTP reflection attacks. Like I said, that can affect the amount of activity on this graph. Even though it says reconnaissance index, the spoof source attacks can show up that way as well. And that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com. You can also find us on Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTraq. And just to emphasize, it's spelled THREATTRAQ. The ThreatTraq video is available at the AT&T Tech channel. It's att.com/ThreatTraq. It's also available on YouTube. There is an audio-only version available on iTunes. First, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Jim and Stan. I thought you had some very good inputs today. Thank you very much. And we'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.